I'll jump into the virtual machine manager console in a couple of minutes. Let's take a network virtualization. So we've said that let's virtualize the network. Fantastic. Let's take all these different subnets. What's one of your biggest problems when you're consolidating a network from, if you've taken over a company or you're merging? What's one of the biggest problems that can potentially happen? Overlapping IP addresses. How many people love, and I mean absolutely with a passion, love reconfiguring hundreds of servers manually? Or have you figured out how to do it with WMI yet? Even then it's a pain because you have to, mapping IP addresses, all these wonderful pieces. So let's take our wonderful scenario of Red Corp and Blue Corp that we've used for quite a while. So Red Corp and Blue Corp are merging, and the feckers, they weren't considerate when they were originally thinking about the merger, had the same IP addresses. How dare they? Two customers, similar IP ranges. What do? Reconfigure? How much time is that going to spend? How much time is that going to take you to reconfigure that particular network? Do you put them on a completely different isolated subnet, route them with VLANs, and then have, oh, well, I'll connect to this and I'll NAT it over here and I'll do fun stuff with this one? Or do I actually, no, do you know what I'll do? I'll do an IPsec GRE tunnel where I encapsulate with different IP addresses and mask them on hardware and then give it back to the open-toed sandal guys. Do you really want to give it back to them? I don't think so. Core requirement now, you're centralizing IT. How many times do you go into a business, any business, and they sort of say, no, less. You need to do more with less. And kind of, what do you mean I need to do more with less? Well, give me more money. No, you need to do more with less, even less money. It's the way it goes. It happens, it works, that's the way it goes. This one here. If you are a developer and you've ever tied an application to an IP address, I will hunt you down. I don't like you. I have gone into a lot of different enterprises where you change the IP address of the application because it was licensed in a particular way, or there's we'll tie it to the IP address because it just makes sense. Giving way to a completely static network where you can't do a lot of things. Really annoying. So are you here? Any developer in here that did that? No? Good. I'll be listening outside as well. So, too expensive to change. Regardless of whether you're an IT admin or a consulting company, every single second you spend costs something. If you don't think it costs something, you really need to re-understand your philosophy and your charging model, because you're giving your time away for free for a consultant. And if you don't think your time costs something to a company, fair play to you if you're getting away with it. But in most companies, you're not going to get away with it. Every single thing we do. For example, in Microsoft, walking around on stage is actually being charged to a specific cost center. So everything costs. So you have to take it down. All the planning that will go into this, all the remapping, all the outages, all the different things that can be associated with re-IPing a network is going to cost money. So let's virtualize it. Well, why not? Let's take the two IP address ranges, run them on the same hardware, and have no overlaps, but still have the same IP ranges. Wouldn't that be cool? I'm not sure if you come across this environment very often, but I've seen a lot of different mergers over the last few years, and it's a cool feature to be able to do it. So, I'll speed it up. So we introduced a thing called the customer address space, which is the IP address ranges of the server. Nothing scientific about it. And then we introduced the concept of the provider address spaces. Now, anyone who knows BGP routing at any sort or any way how RIPE works and the internet allocations, they'll kind of go, well, provider address spaces, you can't get them anymore, just stop talking. No, provider address spaces are something that you're responsible for managing and configuring your environment of free IP blocks that you know that are free, that aren't overlapping with anything inside your network. So you know they're there. You don't have to plan them out. You just kind of go, I want a big block. I have 1,000 IP addresses I have to mask. I want a big block of 1,000 IP addresses. Fantastic. Hang on a second. The IP addresses are the same between blue and red. What's going on here? I thought we were going to not overlap. I thought we were going to have complete isolation and segmentation. Luckily for us, we're not silly. So we introduced a thing called Network Virtualization Generic Routing Encapsulation, or NVGRE, which is a lot shorter, thankfully. Best part, transparent to workloads. So we don't have to worry about the Linux guru sitting there going to go, it just won't work with Linux. It just won't. Nothing works with Linux. I have to recompile the kernel every time. I love Linux, by the way. I do recompile a kernel of Linux quite often, so it's not that I don't know these things. I do actually do it. Any workload, doesn't matter. SQL or you name it, it doesn't matter. If it's an IP address, it can get remapped. That's all it gives it. All it cares. It's only for VM traffic. We can't do it for physical hosts yet. We might do it one day, but at the minute we're talking about VM traffic. And to be honest with you, you're only going to have a certain amount of physical hosts in your environment, and hopefully they will be virtualization hosts. And even more, hopefully they will be Server 2012 hosts after today. Don't smile. I really, really mean it. No, hopefully. Yeah, hopefully you'll see the benefit. So what we did was, even though we have the same IP addresses anywhere, we introduced a thing called the GRE key, which is actually the key which will distinguish the traffic going between the two hosts and how we de-encapsulate and re-encapsulate the actual traffic. So when the traffic arrives in and sees the policy on the switch, it'll say, okay, well, you need to be encapsulated up to a specific, into this particular packet, which is, let's say, 5001, get transmitted across to the network to the other side and get de-encapsulated and sent to the actual right elements. Because the switches, the Hyper-V switches, will have the policies that have been deployed onto it by Virtual Machine Manager. Now, we were having a discussion earlier on of whether or not you could do this without Virtual Machine Manager. So in a lab environment, you could potentially do it without Virtual Machine Manager, in a lab environment. Okay, so don't try this without Virtual Machine Manager. You want to be really good at scripting. And even then, there's some demo scripts on the web which will allow you to test network virtualization, but it's not production ready. And I will stress that down to the ground. So you might see lovely blogs, people going, oh, I did it without it. Don't do it. It's not the point. Centralized management, not script kiddies, not guys just having a bit of fun. It's serious. It's a large-scale enterprise. So does this make sense? Even in its most basic form of the fact that now we can take IP subnets or IP ranges from overlapping networks, not have to reconfigure it and spend all that time planning, and then bring them into our virtualized environment on Server 2012 and System Center Service Pack 1 and actually produce network virtualization. What is the key problem that we have right as this day, right now? Is in order for this traffic to talk outside of the actual virtual, onto the actual physical network, so if you wanted to have a shared resource pool, we're still lacking the network virtualization gateway. And it's part of the reason why I can't demo to you effectively today. But what I've agreed to do would be, the gateway is being released in the next couple of days. We're just waiting for a tick box from Redmond when the guy gets back from holidays. And once it's released, we'll actually produce a couple of blog posts on actually how to configure and do this properly. But I'm going to show you some stuff in Virtual Machine Manager in a couple of seconds about all this. So does this make sense? Centralized management makes sense? Making your make sense? Charge to makes sense. Is there any questions before I show you some stuff? Cool.
With the idea of shared nothing live migration, does that not open up a host of issues that if you have a virtual machine sitting in your red and somebody not completely savvy with the fact that the network is virtualized tries to live migrate virtual machine that has the same IP address on red and blue from one cluster to the other?
So if you go to your centralized management approach, which and use VMM to do your fabric management, and do all the live migrations, and you've deployed all your policies correctly, it's not going to be an issue, because the policies will be deployed across the entire hosts. So we're going to show you something in a second which will just reinforce this logical switch idea, which is that template for deploying across all hosts, which will create it in a very specific way to ensure those policies exist.
Basically, the virtual networks will exist across the entire infrastructure that you are able to live migrate that virtual machine to or from. So if it moves from host A to host Z, it'll still stay in its own VM network and won't get outside of that VM network.
The key what we're trying to get to is centralized management, standardization, and compliance is kind of where. So you'll be able to make everything the same, which is cool. Standardization. What was the other two things? Compliance, and what was the middle thing that I said? I've forgotten already.
Centralization.
Centralization, standardization, centralized management, standardization, and compliance. So compliance, reporting on the fact that if something's not compliant, so you'd be able to do a report on all your hosts and say, well, these guys don't have, someone spun up a new host and they didn't actually apply the virtual switch template to the actual host. You kind of go, okay, run a compliance report to say this host is out of whack. So if the workloads are migrated to it, yes, you will have a problem, but if you do your compliance reports correctly, well, then you have no problem. Because you'll be able to remediate and actually deploy the host, or deploy the host correctly and apply the proper template. So, let's jump in here for a few minutes. Everyone familiar with Virtual Machine Manager? No? You're in for a treat. So, I'm going to ask you that question. You should know more. You wrote the book. So, Virtual Machine Manager, centralized management tool for your Hyper-V networks, or for your Hyper-V machines, for your VMware machines, and for your Red Hat machines. Zen Server, Red Hat, I'll make all the same. I know very few people using Zen Server, so I'll forget about it easily. The point is, 3 different hypervisors you can manage on this as well. There's a small caveat around VMware where you still need vCenter there, and then vCenter will plug into your virtual machines. So getting to the single pane of glass, yeah, I like it. So one of the things you'll see here, so you'll see lovely little bars, VM services, Fabric, library, and jobs. And as Aidan mentioned earlier on, the Fabric is basically the entire infrastructure. So it's where your hosts can actually sit. It's where you do a lot of your configuration initially. And you'll see here we have absolutely tons of stuff. So we can break it down in terms of host groups. So you can have your production, or your development, your test, or whatever your case may be, finance, whatever thing, and apply role-based access across this as well. That'd be cool, wouldn't it? I think so. Manage the host that you're supposed to. Later on, we can create clouds, and you'll see that they're just the different hosts and the amount of information. We have library servers for storing our ISOs and bits and pieces, so you can use a standalone file server and deploy the actual role. There's some delegation stuff that you may have to do just for ISO mounting. I still think you have to do that in VMM 2012, don't you, Aidan? Sorry? The constrained delegation.
Library you do.
Yeah. So you still have to do it in VMM 2012. Pixie servers. Really important feature, boot from host, or so being able to actually just know the ILO address of your IDRAC address of your actual host and being able to power it up, rebuild it into a server 2012 or a server 2008 or 2 host, enable Hyper-V, and then join it into your actual Fabric management and start deploying VMs, or add it into your cloud or add it into your cluster. That'd be a cool feature. And update servers, so patch your servers if you want, and it's cluster aware updating as well with Server 2012 and Service Pack 1 on System Center. Lots of good stuff you can particularly do. But let's get down to the stuff that we're really kind of interested in. We've got a concept called logical networks. Now I busted something earlier on, and I haven't been able to repair it just yet. Deliberately, I locked it out last night on a very slow broadband connection at home. And I tried to repair it this morning, but I haven't cleared up a policy correctly. So some of the stuff is just going to look weird. But we'll talk through it because I really just want to explain the concepts more than else. It's still a very new technology. So you get your logical networks here. And hello, Alan Stone. You got your logical networks here, and your logical network is your abstraction from the physical layer. So this is a thing that you can potentially apply to all the different hosts if you want. But it kind of doesn't make sense just yet. But what's really interesting is the IP pools that you can start to attach into it. So you now, and remember we were talking about IPAM yesterday? Had a lot of fun around V1. IPAM can actually help you manage this as well. It's really cool, so they were thinking. Going ahead and going forward, IPAM will plug in. It's great. I think that's really important. Forward vision thinkers we are. But anyway, so let's just create a sample IP. So let's just create a sample virtual network first, just to kind of go. Now, one of the things that you'll notice, okay, we have a few here. So if you actually import a Hyper-V host with a switch that's already created, it will actually create the logical network for you to allow you to start doing these associations. Okay, it'll do it for you. You can turn that off because if you're importing lots of hosts and you have lots of multiple logical networks, it makes no sense. You only want the logical networks that you actually configure. So you can delete them and turn them off. You just turn them off in settings here, in network settings, and right here, you untick that box so that when a host is imported, that it doesn't automatically create the actual logical networks for you. You'd like to do it manually in many cases. So you can create a quick logical network. Fantastic. So we'll just go test via our logical network, just to show you. So one of the things that we can introduce is network sites, so we can start associating IP blocks to a particular name for later on usage. And this is the only place that you need to select this right now if you're thinking about using network virtualization and this NVGRE stuff that we were talking about earlier on. If you don't select it now, you come back later on, you tick the box, you click OK, you think, great, I'm enabled, and then you come back, you click it, open it again, and you realize the tick box, and then you click it again, and you keep on repeating this, and then you realize you have to delete the whole thing and actually restart with your logical network. So if you're going to enable network virtualization, enable it here right now. Okay? If you're not, it's no big deal. You can say network sites within this logical network are not connected, so that if you specify multiple IP pools, so 192.168.0.0/24, 192.168.10/24, all on the different VLANs, that they actually can't talk to each other, that's good. You can do that and you can stop that actual isolation right now. So I'm just going to tick this off and tick this right now, just because I want to get to a point where I can show you this. So let's add a network site, and then we'll just kind of go with test logical network site. Actually, I don't like the test logical network site. Let's go Dublin. Let's just go Dublin subnet and 192.168. Oh no, I'm using that 169.0.0/24. Okay, and let's just associate it with a particular set of hosts that we know can only serve that particular traffic, because not all hosts might be able to serve that traffic. We mightn't want all hosts to be able to serve that, because this might be production. So we'll just give it a VLAN. And we'll just type in the subnet 00/24. So you do have to be familiar with /CIDR notation within inside IP subnets. CIDR notation just specifies that slash whatever it may be, /25/24. So that's fantastic. Actually, I'll add another subnet just for fun, and then we'll just call it Galway subnet instead of New York, and we'll just go 192.168.0.0/24. And we'll just go VLAN 10, and we know that's 192.168, /24. And again, we'll just associate. So that's fantastic. That's great. That's those things. So if you associate a logical network with particular IP subnets, that can actually be attached to that. So you can have multiple different logical networks if you want, specifying different things within inside your environment, if you so want. Like if you think it's easier to create a production logical network, a development logical network, and a test logical network, or a UAT, well then fantastic, do it. So let's go into our test logical network, and what really becomes important then is we want to create an IP pool. Because again, we don't want to know about IP addresses. We don't want to have to go and every single time think about what IP address do I have to sign. You can use IPAM, or you cannot. It is V1. So let's go Dublin IP subnet and test. So it's the 192.169.0/24, and we'll just copy that because I want to repaste it in here. But it's bound to the actual test logical network, so that's great. We're getting there. Let's use an existing logical site already, because we know it's a Dublin one, so it does its best association onto the actual host group. So all this stuff is already pre-filled into it, so I don't have to think about it. Now, we want to do assign from an IP range with inside it. So you can give it the whole IP range if you want. You can reserve stuff for virtual load balancers if you want, for VIPs, because now in sort of VMM, we have the ability to configure load balancers. We have plugins that will actually be able to do it. There is a supported list that you can actually do. Or IP reserves for other uses, so you might want to put some static IP addresses in on that particular network for some devices for whatever particular reason. The IP address, once it's allocated to the machine, stays with the machine forever and a day until the machine dies, and then at some point in the future, we will reclaim it. So it's not wasted. Put in your gateway if you want, put in your DNS if you want, put in all those bits and pieces, And again, for those script savvy people, if you just want to copy and paste the script and actually modify and verbalize it up and make it into a small tool, you can then just make it into a tool where it prompts value. You don't have to keep going through the console if you want. Spend a lot of time and effort, the teams, to make sure we expose as much PowerShell as possible so that you guys can actually create these tools. And imagine if you're a consultant going into all these different environments and have a single set of scripts that will configure up your environment for you, rather than having to do it manually each and every time. Which is kind of cool. So you'll see now that right down here, the subnet's allocated to this. And we can do the exact same thing. We can create one for the Galway subnet if we really want. So create an IP pool, if I can remember. So Galway IP pool. And you'll see, let's get the drop down list. Thank you. That's the subnet. The IP ranges to allocate from. Next, 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 next. So now we have 2 IP pools associated to that. That's fantastic. Now let's talk about these 3 things. So you'll see 3 things there. So you'll see the logical switches, the native port profile, and the port classifications. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure that if a workload, let's take the guesswork out of it for you guys. So with all these different classifications, and we're now giving optimizations and prioritizations on the virtual switch for this type of workload. So you have a host cluster workload, it requires a specific set of settings. Now you don't have to think about it. The teams went off and knocked their heads together and figured out, hang on a second, let's include it by default into the product to make your life easier. So now we've got host classification profiles. You can create some yourself for your specific workloads, but look at the amount of stuff that you do have. So you have SRIOV, host management, network load balancing, live migration. So you can apply all these different port classifications so that they're optimized in a particular way to actually transmit this traffic across the virtual switch and out onto the network, making life a little bit easier. Port profiles, same sort of thing. You have to associate to an adapter, a virtual network, a VNIC or a virtual network adapter, and this will become a little bit more apparent when I actually can go to configure the host and apply a logical switch template in a second. But you can apply a port profile or a port classification to a port profile, and then it will allow me to assume characteristics of a certain thing, of that certain virtual NIC, and it'll be configured in a specific way. You can mix and match if you want, but it doesn't really make sense that if you create you want a high profile or a high bandwidth NIC and you put a low port classification on it, you kind of try and keep them in a single sense, configure it out like that. We got this special one here called the uplink profile. So you need an uplink profile. Why? To connect out to the actual network. So this is if you want your external connection to the actual physical network when you're actually going to deploy it. So let's just create a quick port profile, let's create a quick maybe it's because I have one already. So I'll show you. So you're given the option. So you remember the Hyper-V port load balancing algorithm that Aidan showed you earlier on inside of Hyper-V? Centralized management, coming here. Switch independent. And if you drop them down, you have the different options of what you can actually do. So similar to what you're doing in Hyper-V, but now you're creating one port profile to be able to apply to all your different hosts for consistency. Your network configuration. Hang on, these are my virtual networks. It's just these are the virtual networks that are allowed to use this particular uplink. If I don't tick it in here, well then when I go later on to deploy a VM or deploy a virtual network, I can't now do all the associations. So you're building it up, you're creating your port classifications, you're creating your uplink profile, you're creating your logical networks, you're then creating your IP pools, and now we're getting into a point where we're going to create logical switches and VM networks. It's very confusing because there's lots you have to do initially, and then it's standard, it's done, it's dusted. So you can click OK with that. So we got our Hyper-V uplink profile. That's great. So now let's create our logical switch. So on a logical switch, so you can enable SRIOV if you have it enabled on your NICs. Fantastic. But again, it's not to be used for, no, it can be used, sorry, it's RDMA that I always get mixed up with. Don't mind me. So extensions. So your logical switch, remember what it is. This is the equivalent to your distributed switch on VMware. It's obviously different. But it's the concept is the same. It's a single switch that can be applied across all your different hosts. This particular name, the L switch all hosts, is the name of the virtual switch that's going to be created on each Hyper-V host when you apply the actual profile to the machines. Okay, so you'll see it in a second, and it will be great. It'll be fantastic. On your switch, you're kind of going, well, I want my uplink mode to be a team. So straight away, it'll want to team the network cards. This goes back into your converged network stuff that Aidan was talking about earlier on. So previously, you have umpteen NICs to be able to configure a proper cluster with all the different management NICs and then teaming and high availability and all the rest of it. Now you could potentially do it with 2 NICs with a bunch of virtual NICs on top and still provide the same isolation and port classifications and profiles to be able to prioritize the traffic out of your actual VM networks or your ports and stuff. So we've associated, so you can see we've associated this particular Hyper-V, this uplink profile that we created earlier into here, and it's ready to use. So that is what it's going to use. So it knows about the association, about the logical networks to be allowed out. I don't have to go to each individual host and configure each individual host to have those logical networks associated with it. Previously in VMM 2012, you always had to associate each logical network with the host or the physical NIC that you wanted to be able to allow it to transmit out onto the network, which was a real pain. I believe so, anyway. And now we get to specify what port classifications and what potential workloads we're going to transmit over this particular virtual switch. So it will then send all the policies down to the actual machine and configure it appropriately. So again, standardization, centralized management, easy for you guys. Yes, I am very aware there's a lot of new concepts here. I'm very aware there seems to be a lot of steps. Imagine being able to take a PowerShell script in a couple of weeks and modifying it just for your little environment and being able to deploy this in about 3 or 4 seconds, rather than the few minutes that it's taken me to actually go. The key to all this is planning, as always. So you'll see that one of the things that we've decided to do was, even if we create a new, so let's just add one here just for example. So we create a new port classifications and we just say iSCSI workloads. Include a network virtual adapter port and you'll see that straight away there's iSCSI. So that will create the port classification on the actual Hyper-V switch, and then it will allow you to create a virtual NIC which will have the same policies, which will give you the prioritization for your iSCSI traffic right down to the switch level and onto the actual network. Without you guys having to do any specific configuration and understanding of port classifications or network adapter profiles or things like that, because these were developed by the product group and were optimized in a particular way between the Server 2012 product group and the VMM product group, as much as they're not supposed to talk. But they do sometimes. So our final kind of core thing that we need to do is go into the properties of the particular host and go down to virtual switches. Actually, I'm going to go to a different host just because I broke that one earlier on. So let's just show you 2 things. So previously, you'd have to go into each individual NIC and tick the networks that you wanted enabled. That would be a real pain, wouldn't it? Real pain. Let's just do it the virtual switch way. So you still got the option, so you can create a new logical switch or a new standard switch. So the new standard switch is your standard Hyper-V switch that you can go into your Hyper-V manager today, configure and just do to the cows come home until you're happy. But you need to remember all the different IP addresses. You need to remember all the different names on all the different hosts and make sure it's all mapped correctly. You need to understand your NICs. Why do I want to do that? That just seems like work. So now I apply a new logical switch and I've got my logical switch profile that I've already configured with all the settings that I have, so I don't have to think about it. I don't have to remember that I have to include. Hang on a second, I list 4 NICs. It knows the machine has 4 NICs. It knows it wants a team, so let's just select, for example, NIC 35 and 36. So let me just jump out of here for 2 seconds and show you something. Let's see if Avocent is going to play up for me. Didn't want to do that, but anyway. Let's go network connections. So I want you to realize something. So no NIC teaming, right here, right now. 4 individual NICs. Okay. Virtual switch manager, no virtual switch. Now, let's put a little caveat out there. If you do this and manage it centrally like you're supposed to, if you do any individual configuration from Hyper-V afterwards, Virtual Machine Manager is going to wipe that configuration and apply its profile back. Why? Because that's what you want. You want that centralized management. You want that always to happen. You don't want someone coming along and thinking they're the open-toed standalone networking guy making the changes just because they're gurus. You don't want that. You want that centralized management, and this is where we're getting to. So I have to remember all the different keys. There we go. So let's just skip back here for 2 seconds. So now I'm going to just go click OK. Now at this point here, so that's just going to create a team. Where I broke my stuff earlier on, and I'll be perfectly honest, was around the new virtual networks. I did something that won't unbind. So even if I type in, for example, I want to create a management NIC, I don't get all the networks properly because it's not being unbound properly. It was something that I did on the hosts, and I haven't been able to clean it up and fix it, which is why I committed to doing a blog post in a couple of weeks when I've sorted it all out and I have time to do it and do it all. So it'll be posted on the IE Pro website for you guys to have a look at it and actually run through the steps if you just want to demo it out afterwards. But for example, you can select your management network, you can have your IP pools assigned, and you can click OK and it will create a virtual NIC, but I know it's going to fail, so I'm just going to not create that particular virtual NIC straight away. I know that. So if I click OK and I click yes, okay? So let that job go off and run. So let's go into have a look at Virtual Machine Manager in the full screen and while it's going white. Zero configuration and this stuff is happening for me. Takes a few minutes, just there's a few things it has to do and rebind. But you'll see suddenly, because I've ticked it for management as well, this particular thing, it's creating an internal NIC which will allow me for management. It'll create the team, it'll add the 2 things, and you'll notice 2 NICs will no longer say contosa.ie, and they'll be now part of the actual individual team. You can go into Server Manager, have a look at your team, fantastic. And you'll see that the team now comprises of the 2. Now, I do realize that it says fail active pending. It takes about 5 minutes and then it comes out of that particular thing. I'm not overly stressed about that. It will actually come out of it, even though the NIC is up. And if you want to reboot from updates, there you go, it's active. So there you go. So it's very simple. Apply a logical switch right across your networks, right across your different hosts. Same profile, didn't have to think about it, included the NICs that I wanted, it bonded them, it brought it back up. You do have to be careful sometimes about your management stuff. You do have to have that well defined in your IP addresses. There's some quirky little things in terms of you might get locked out or knocked off the network, which that happened to me last night. I forgot to include 1 NIC, which is part of the reason why I didn't include the 4 NICs this time. I only included the 2 NICs because I didn't specify a particular management NIC and I broke the management particular networks. So I've one other last thing just to show you. So on your VM networks, if we just go create VM networks. So your VM networks, so your VMs attached to your VM networks are associated to your logical networks. Your logical networks are a part of your logical switch profile, which are then assigned to your hosts. Make sense? So on is the public site Serverpedia. There is a poster. Believe it or not, there is actually a really good workload poster which we'll root out and we'll post on the blog, which explains all this incredible detail and the flow and what happened. And if you look at the System Center Virtual Machine Manager blog, a guy called Nigel Kane and Damien Flynn have actually created a couple of blog posts on step-by-steps on how to do this as well. But we'll create I'll do a little video in a couple of weeks when we have the gateway and all the bits and pieces sorted out properly for you guys to see. So, for example, let's just go. So tests. So you'll see. There you go. So I've already pre-configured like a virtual network a logical network that's had the network virtualization tick on. And this is the part of where you can do your particular associations. So you'll see here we want to isolate the traffic. Fantastic. IP4 to IP4 or IPv6 to IPv6 if you understand that. You might, I don't know. But you shouldn't have that problem. Then you associate the particular subnets that are actually the bits that you want to isolate. So these are the customer traffic that you want to isolate and encapsulate. So you will have a VM network called red, and then you'll have a VM network called blue, and you'll get the particular associations. And then when you go to connect your VM, you'll say, this is on the blue subnet. And then when it kind of transmits out, it will get encapsulated to that particular IP space. Now the reason why we can't demo it, I'll show you properly anyway. I'll just put any old IP address. It doesn't really matter at this stage. The reason why we can't demo is this. We've no gateway. So we can't demo the fact that the actual traffic will actually route on and do all the bits and pieces properly. Because the gateway technically doesn't exist. Well, it does exist, it's just not released to us just yet. And that's part of the reason for the blog post later on. So it's something I would love to demo, but it's because it's a relatively new concept, because we don't have that particular gateway just yet, it's actually impossible to demo, believe it or not. Anyway, so what you need, see a Server 2012 Hyper-V, I think you get that by now. System Center 2012 Service Pack 1. Network design. I can't stress enough how much time you should spend actually planning out these networks properly and actually document them correctly. Even if it's in a Visio network or whatever, saved on a shared drive that other people can access and not on your local laptop, that's what you need to do. And take into account your hardware considerations. Do you have the hardware to run SRIOV? Do you have the hardware to run RDMA? Do you have the hardware that has RSS turned on the NIC? How much hardware do you have? Do you have 10 gig Ethernet? Do you have gig backbones? What do you have? Take into all this account, because it might actually just make more sense to spend a couple of months upgrading your actual systems before you actually dive into this. Or you might say, no, everything's actually good and we're all good and we can go straight in and you can go into your network design. But spend plenty of time on your network design. If you don't, you'll get it wrong and then you'll be in trouble. Because now you're becoming responsible for the network. Networks down are usually bad. So, anyway, questions? Not from Aidan.
No, it's a good one.
What?
I actually think the Iron Networks network virtualization gateway is available.
Oh, cool.
It's called MNV, so Monkey November Vienna Alliance. I don't know that. I'm not a pilot.
Mike November.
Mike November Victor
Oh, God.
Alliance.
That's maths and phonetic alphabet you're not good at. There we go.
That too.
So we know. So any questions? No? Fantastic.
Is there any cost overhead to the virtualization of the network in regards to the host and all the traffic, or is it just really policies? So
It's really policies. It's like everything. There's always going to be
that's what I mean.
a teeny tiny bit, but it's like the same type of overhead that you'll get on kind of the distributed switch and the policies that are applied to that. It really is. It's negligible. So I'm gonna get the three of you guys up here. Come up. No, you as well. No, I'm serious. Listen, if I have to stand up and take abuse, you guys have to as well. So, are we recording this? Will we record this? So I'll just repeat the question. So, we stand between you and lunch. Your lunch is probably not there yet, so you have to stay with us for at least 10 minutes. So, this afternoon will be our MMS sessions. The best of MMS, and I do hope you hang around for them, because there's some really kind of cool concepts and stuff that we want to talk to you about. Right across from Azure to SCOM to unified device management to automation to private cloud and all those bits and pieces in between. So there's a lot of good stuff this afternoon, so please do hang around. But you've got a chance to ask any technical question.
Hey, you mentioned on the replica that don't need the body who's a VSS. On the replicas, the industry there.
So the VSS is if you're keeping historical copies, it's not for your normal replication.
I was thinking of like exchange and stuff that we are replicating there, but should you not use the VSS for sure, because you want that clean.
So exchange,
Let me
answer
answer
this.
this.
No, let me answer this. So Exchange are my least favorite product group in Microsoft. Because they don't believe there's a need in the world for virtualization. The Exchange product group believe everybody has multiple terabytes of memory in their Exchange mailbox servers, and they should be physical, yada, yada, yada. For example, we didn't have support for live migration or vMotion until Exchange 2010 which is what, 2 years ago? Not that long ago. That's when they first supported it, because they thought, well, why would you ever want to virtualize an Exchange? And in fact, the Exchange product group do not support Hyper-V Replica.
Yeah, well, I'll come from a different point. No, just slightly
So
different.
he works for Microsoft.
Disclaimer.
MVPs are independent experts.
The argument would be that if you're going to virtualize with all the lovely anti-affinity stuff, and you're going to virtualize Exchange and you're going to do DAGs, why would you need Hyper-V Replica? It just doesn't make sense.
I know, yeah, that's the other.
That's what, so it's not even, it's agnostic. I would argue this for Oracle replication. Anything that can be replicated out of the box in terms of application, and the supporting or the application that sits on top of that particular database functionality. If that can be replicated natively in an application, do it natively in the application, as long as it doesn't cost you an arm and a leg. That's the real kind of core thing. Yay for Microsoft. But no.
I can't do that to customer, yay for Microsoft.
No, I'd say EA for Microsoft, not yay. EA. It's all about sales. You gotta go. Stay with me.
We would prefer open licensing.
What?
We would
I think
prefer
open licensing, yeah. I think I'm looking for independent. Only messing. But no, my argument would be is that any application stack, you know, with the right anti-affinity rules, really you need having to work for Africa. And it was one of the decisions that we made in a customer recently when they were putting in Server 2012 and they were looking at their DO is that we only replicated about kind of 20% of the VMs because the rest of them we can provide a native application failure. So
you can do the same with SQL Server 2012 as well, so it has a similar sort of functionality. So centralize your databases with multiple instances on a single SQL Server 2012 cluster, which is replicating itself at the application layer, and then opt out of replicating those virtual machines.
just a different approach.
Is it that much cheaper to do with the DAG and maybe use remote rental instead of
So it very much depends on the environment and the model that you're running. So you know, I'm very privileged. I'm very privileged to work for Microsoft. I'm very privileged to ignore the fact that people have to pay licenses, and I will recommend what would be technology, what would be the ideal scenario in technology, and then we'll pare back down to what you can actually afford.
Well, in theory, if you're licensing legally, there would be no price difference between either.
So one of the things that Microsoft has done is that, you know, for different products, they want you to license the core product and the CAL. So, and then after that, you can spin off a couple of different licenses without kind of major issue. They spend a lot of time messing around with that licensing model to try and support and make life easier, but it's by no means perfect. By no means a licensing builder, and they'll always tell you to go and verify what can and can't be done. But as you purchase a new product, check with the licensing guys of the virtualization rights, or if you're bringing in, or how many instances can you spin up in terms of disaster proof, because you will be very surprised at what you can actually do out of the box with your license. Any other questions?
Just from the partner perspective, do you have any support in IP just for designing Hyper-V environments that make sure that you'll cover all the networking components that need to be?
This home independence thing, you know, is it's a commercial property.
So John will give you the Microsoft answer.
So we used to have a thing called IPD guides, which I'm not sure
They're gone now.
I'm not sure if we've created anymore.
So if you were doing a supportability review, what would you look at?
So here's a different point of view. So I work for an organisation called Premier, which have IP around all this type of stuff, which is supportability assessment, but it's paid for IP. And if you're part of the managed partner space, you're forced to buy a Premier contract, and you can get access to all this IP. If you're looking to know someone in MCS, Wink, they have a ton of documentation which you could actually go and actually ask for nicely, because they have absolutely step-by-steps on absolutely everything. Honestly, and this would be the brutal, I'm not just plugging his book, but between Aidan, between Kevin, between Damien Flynn, between Hans Riederborg, between Didier Van Hoy. All these different guys are absolute super geniuses at this stuff. Super geniuses at this stuff. There's no point in kind of missing the word. They do it, they have the practical applications, they tell you what they've come across in an environment. When you read the technical documentation, it will be the step-by-step guides and not the actual end result of what potentially could happen on different types of hardware and so forth. So it's a mixture. I apologize in advance, it's a mixture. The important thing is something I'm going to mention later on when we're talking about private cloud. And it's all around kind of design. All the best practice principles are there. They're very publicly available around NICs, around the amount of things that you need to do, performance, your storage, how it should be designed, what the kind of the recommendations. It's all up on TechNet. There's Wikipedia pages, there's the guys' blogs, and readily available because most of them link each other, so you can click around and have a look at different recommendations. If you want official Microsoft IP, you have a partner channel that you can go to, and you can ask some guys who sit in Reading, and they will actually gather any of the specific Server 2012 IP. You also on your partner portal have a whole bunch of features that you can actually have a look. And most Microsoft partners, I think it's on Go level or above or whatever the application status is now, you can actually ring you guys on the helpline and they'll get you even more IP that has been specifically partner focused and partner centric. But if you talk to, who's your, Eamon Breen, the partner, is the partner technical advisor. Neil Hetherington was, and he's still doing a little bit of a job. But they're the two guys inside SMS and P in Ireland which you should talk to. Or, I won't bet you.
You can find it for me if you like, and I'll happily find your answer. Yeah, we'll do that.
So I'll give you the non-Microsoft answer. Now John's giving you the Microsoft answer. No. I'll be brutally honest, and I'm having this conversation with Redmond. There's myself and a few others who've been quite vocal about this with them. That the one flaw is the official documentation. There are specific white papers which I call out and praise, like the NIC teaming white paper, the QoS document that's up on TechNet, and actually will give you the PowerShell for deploying converged network stuff if you don't want to do it through VMM. Stuff like that is very, very well written. However, there's a lot of stuff in terms of failover clustering that just isn't documented, and there's a lot of stuff in Hyper-V that the Microsoft product group haven't documented publicly. And that's just the brutal, honest truth of it.
On the failover clustering, is there any more information out there? It's something that we're looking at quite in detail, but yet the more you start to scratch the surface, the more you figure out. They're not
Basically what John said, have a look at the various blogs, the books.
So let me tell you something very, very simple and easy. So in the support services side of the business, we have a thing called RAPS, Risk Assessment Programs, or health checks.
Yeah.
The Cluster 2012 RAP assessment or health check, or whatever you want to call it, has been taken out. Why? Because the actual wizard that it goes through, it gives you all those bits and pieces for it, is so good they don't need to do it anymore.
Yeah, but the thing is, people when they're designing want to have the design done before they run the cluster validation.
No, absolutely. But the guidance on the mix, it hasn't really changed that much in a lot of years.
It's not NICs even anymore, it's communications channels. So it could actually be a single NIC, but you're doing QoS protocol layer. And so there's just so many variables in this stuff now, it's gotten difficult to document.
Yeah.
Because there's no one right way of doing the networking on a host or a cluster. So it comes down to understanding the fundamentals of things like QoS and convert networks, NIC teaming, Hyper-V switch. And when you understand those topics, then you can actually design these things pretty quickly. Like when I know what sort of storage someone wants, what offloads they want to turn on, I can spit out a host or a cluster design pretty quickly. And even reproduce the PowerShell for them right there, right then to deploy it, or step through the VMM stuff to actually create it instead of using PowerShell. So you literally just have to import like the process of your Drax or your ILOs, and everything's deployed for you. You could go off and have your lunch and come back and your hosts are up and running, your cluster and all that good stuff.
Yeah. I'm really impressed, but the last one then is We thought the cloud and all the rest of them, for anything, any clouds that they was for, this one. Will that extend to non-Microsoft clouds? So Amazon cloud, VM cloud?
Not yet.
At this minute, if I know.
Not
So
yet.
so we've got a really good story about Azure, and even then, if I'm brutally honest, there's ways of doing it with Orchestrator, but it's a way of doing it, and it's convoluted at best at this particular time.
But it's coming, the industry wants it, the industry
Yeah.
already
So-
between clouds.
There's a neutral format called OVF,
Yeah.
Alright.
which is what the industry wants everyone to start embracing for massaging virtual machines or services through various clouds. You already know that there's cloud brokers out there who literally you call up and say, I just need space, and they will find you the cheapest or the highest available or whatever space, and you really don't care other than the region where that space is.
It's lunch, but can I ask a couple of questions just quickly while I've got a lot of people in the room, because it's kind of to number two. Did anyone steal one in 94?
No, customers are.
2000?
No customers of that.
Oh, well, I know some customers one in 94 too. 2000?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, can we do, just to make it easy for the tongue to breathe? 2003?
Yeah.
Nearly, that's scary, isn't it? I guess 2003 R2, say
Yeah.
2008?
Yeah.
If you want 2008 R2, and 12. 12's getting there. VMware, I've got you in the room. Hyper-V, anyone using Zen and other ones like KVM and other weird ones. It's good enough. And let's get the last one then. Who's going to be running 2012 in the not too distant future? We'll say this year. 2012 this year. Okay? You haven't done that good a job then. Next year, would you go back to the offices and go and convince people that 2012 is a good thing to go looking at and they should really start evaluating it at least? Yeah. Cool.
So-
That's not one of 2003, that's scary.
So, is everyone staying for the session this afternoon?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Okay, so lunch is back in 42.